This walkthrough will demonstrate techniques for using home inventory to manage changes in beneficiaries over time. Navigate to other tools. Open the Who form. For this example, we're going to track the life cycle of beneficiaries associated with a couple, John and Jane, who get married, and manage the designated beneficiaries for their inventory items over time. To begin, we'll create two beneficiaries, John and Jane, enter key, then we'll navigate over to the Other Tools tab. Go back to the main menu and open the inventory spreadsheet. John and Jane have pre-populated the database with items they collectively brought into the marriage. To make this example simpler, we're going to just work with one of the categories. For this example, it'll be appliances. We'll click in any appliance category item, go up to Selection, and click Appliances. The first thing that John and Jane would like to do is to go through their list of items and make note of who brought the item into the marriage. To proceed, we'll use the End key on the keyboard to navigate to the Who column, which is the last column, and we'll scroll over and put the Who column right next to the Description column. It will make this task easier. Next, they will go through this list and apply their name to the item they brought into the marriage. The alarm clock, that'll be Jane. Mr. Coffee, that'll be John. Off camera, I'm going to complete this process. After John and Jane complete designating who brought what into the marriage, I'll go back to Other Tools. Open the Who Gets What spreadsheet. This spreadsheet will list any item that a beneficiary has been designated for. In this case, it's all the appliance items. We'll close this with a small x, and we'll open the Who Gets What report. Want to see all categories, but we only did one category, so that's the only one we'll see. These are all the appliance items that Jane has indicated she brought into the marriage. Page down. And these are all the appliance items that John brought into the marriage. Close with the Escape key. We'll go back to the inventory spreadsheet. Now at present, it looks like all the items have been designated as to where they came from, but doesn't necessarily mean that's how they should reside. Specifically, John and Jane decide that for a couple of these items, they want to retain personal ownership even though they're married. But most of the items they'll designate as joint property. So to fix that issue, we're going to go back to the Who list. I'm going to create some new beneficiary names. One will be John, joint, and enter key, and Jane, joint, enter key. The purpose of naming it this way is to give John and Jane a way to indicate in their inventory list that they brought an item into the marriage, but they declared the item to be joint at some point during the marriage. So we'll go back to the inventory spreadsheet, and we need to make those designations in the Who column. By way of a few examples, let's say that John thinks the George Foreman grill is a great thing, and he decides, declare it. Now, I just opened the drop-down, and you don't see anybody else listed there. We have to refresh all. We'll go back to the George Foreman grill, open the drop-down, and there are the other choices now. John brought it in. We're going to make it John Joint, okay? And we'll do the same thing with, let's say, the dehumidifier. Jane brought that in, but she thinks it's important. She's going to declare it to be joint property. And we'll do one more. The vacuum cleaner. Jane says that should be the joint property. We both need it. We'll make one more. We'll do the same for John's rotisserie, joint property. So now we have a way of instantly indicating the status of an inventory item. In the case of the George Foreman grill, we can see that John brought it into the marriage, but he declared it to be joint property for purposes of ownership. Over time, John and Jane have two children, Anne and Ben. After the birth of those children, they decide they need to update their inventory list to indicate beneficiaries for Anne and Ben as to who will receive their property. So we'll go back to the Who list, and we need to create some additional beneficiary names. One will be called John for those items that John just brought into the marriage, and he kept in his name. We're going to have it John and Ace, meaning John can designate that item going directly to Anne, and John to Ben. Now, John also has some joint property he brought in, so we need a beneficiary called John. Joint and John joint Ben. Off camera, we're going to do the same thing for Jane's beneficiary list. Now that we have that issue covered, we'll go back to the inventory spreadsheet. We need to refresh all to make sure those new beneficiaries show up in the drop-down list. And now we can go through this and set these things accordingly. By way of just a simple example, John Mr. Coffee, he brought it into the marriage, kept it for himself, and he decides he wants that to go to Ben. Ben likes his coffee. John had a joint item. He brought into the marriage this George Foreman grill, and he wants to give that to, and so we'll pick John, joint, and likewise, for Jane, she has a joint item here, dehumidifier. She wants to give that to Anne. So there's Jane joint Anne and enter key. And Jane has a heating pad, so she gives that to Ben. Likewise, they can go through the entire list and make those designations. And the purpose of using this naming schema is that you could immediately look at an inventory item and know its history. This item brought into the marriage by John. John declared joint property and he wants it to go to Anne. Vice versa, this item, the heating pad, brought into the marriage. Jane, she kept it as personal property, not joint, and she wants it to go to Ben. Once that task has been completed, they can close the inventory spreadsheet, and we're finished with the who list for the time being. We'll close that. We'll take a look at the who gets what spreadsheet, and here we have a listing, again, of only items that there is a beneficiary designated, and we can immediately see where they're going. If necessary, we can make any corrections here, for instance. The portable R shortwave radio. John says I really want Ben to have that, and so forth. We'll close this. Take a look at the who gets what report. Now we can see the Jane. Appliances that she brought into the marriage and she keeps personal title to are all listed here. Any items that Jane brought into the marriage she wants to give directly to Ben, they're still personal items to her, are listed here, page down, same for Jane joint the vacuum cleaner. She keeps that. Or she brought that into the marriage and it's joint property. Jane joint N is an appliance that she brought into the marriage, declared a joint property, and she wants to give it to Anne. John has these appliances he brought into the marriage. He hasn't designated anybody to receive him yet. He considers and personal items, page down, and John wants Ben to have his portable shortwave radio and Mr. Coffee, and John declared as joint property the broiler rotisserie. It's not going to any of the kids yet, and John brought in the George Farmer grill, declared it joint property, and he wants and get it in the end. We'll close this with a small X. We'll navigate back to who with respect to the naming convention used. You can use any convention that will work for you and suits your purposes. The key in the convention is to be able to look at a name and immediately recognize the history of that item again. In this example, Jane joint Ben indicates that Jane brought it into the marriage. She declared it to be joint property or marital property, and she wants it to pass to Ben. John brought this item whatever would be into the marriage. He didn't declare it joint property, and he hasn't picked a designated beneficiary yet. We'll close the who form. We'll reopen the who gets what spreadsheet. You can filter this view and see who gets what in a quick way. For example, let's suppose that we want to see what items actually just belong to John. So what we'll do is we'll click on this item, John only, go up here to selection and pick John. Now all these items are items that John brought into the marriage, and he still considers them personal property. We'll unfilter using this button. Likewise, if we want to see any items that John brought into the marriage, considered joint property, and then wants to give it to NDE, he can do the same thing, selection, John joint N, and there's that single item, unfiltered. We'll close the who gets what spreadsheet, and we'll go back to the main menu.